Hello and welcome to another video. This is Jennifer McGuire. Over the past several months, I've done many videos showing fun things you can do with alcohol inks from Tim Holtz. They are so much fun to use for creating unique backgrounds. Well, today I'm back to share some more ideas using a few new products that Tim has come out with that are really cool and allow you to get more out of your alcohol inks. One of these new products is Alcohol Lift Ink. This is a brilliant ink pad that allows you to lift ink off of an alcohol inked surface and stamp it on another paper so you can get two cards at once. And I'm also going to show you how you can use it with stencils. There are many other techniques and I'll share some of those in the future. So here is a look at the Tim Holtz Alcohol Lift Ink. This is a very unique clear ink that is designed specifically to lift color from an inked non-porous surface and transfer it to a porous surface. Now that sounds complicated, but it is very simple. Basically, when you create an alcohol ink background on something like Yupo paper, you can stamp with this ink and it lifts the color off of it. And then you can stamp it onto regular cardstock and leave some color behind on that cardstock. So you'll see it in action today and it'll make more sense, but this is the special ink that we're going to use. I will also link to a video that I did a while back where I showed how to lift ink from an alcohol inked surface. But with this ink, you can actually transfer that ink to another project. But if you want to, you can check out that other video for more ideas. When creating alcohol ink backgrounds, I like to use Tim Holtz Yupo paper. Yupo paper is a synthetic paper that is non-porous, which is perfect for taking alcohol inks. Now it does feel like a plastic paper and you really can't tear it. In the past, I used the regular alcohol ink Yupo, but now they have a heavy stock alcohol ink Yupo, which is 144 pounds. It's nice and thick, still die cuts nicely, and works great for alcohol ink backgrounds. And that's what I'm going to be using today. You could use either version. Keep in mind the techniques I do for the backgrounds where I'm applying alcohol ink. You could also do with other non-porous surfaces, such as acetate. Okay, so we'll stick with the white Yupo for today, and I'll tell you if I end up using anything else, which I will do later in the video. The best way to understand these new products is to start creating, so let's start with this pair of cards. I have a piece of Yupo paper. Remember, Yupo paper is non-porous, so that means you can use alcohol inks on it and the color will move around. I'm applying different Tim Holtz alcohol inks. I ended up putting a lot of color down. You definitely don't need that much. A few drops would be fine. Now to get this moving quickly, I have a little mist bottle with rubbing alcohol, like you find at the grocery store. I'm going to spritz that on there. I don't often do that. Not sure why I decided to do it today, but you can see that it reacts right away. Now here is an alcohol ink blending tool. It has a piece of felt on the bottom of it. That allows you to dab around and move color and get some really neat looks. I'll be using this again later in the video. Now my favorite way to move the color around is to blow air through a straw. I find that really works well and it's easy to control where things move a bit better. You can also use Tim Holtz blending solution, which moves the color differently than rubbing alcohol. I'm putting some onto one of the felt tip applicators and just lightly dabbing it onto the background, and you can see the fun reaction that you get. Again, if you're new to this, check out my beginner video. I'll link to it here, and it talks more about these things and shows a closer look. But once I'm happy with my background, I just set it aside to dry for a bit. Next, I trim the panel down to be about 3 3/4 by about 4.5 inches. But keep in mind, all those leftover strips and pieces can be used on another card. You can even die cut things from this, so don't get rid of any of those pieces. But for this particular card, I just need that one size. I keep a little bowl with my alcohol ink scraps. Next, I'm cutting a piece of regular white cardstock, good old-fashioned white cardstock, to be the same size. So what I have is a non-porous piece of paper covered in alcohol ink. That's the one on the right. Then I have a piece of porous paper. Regular cardstock is porous. You need a non-porous that's inked up and a porous, which is plain cardstock. And we're going to lift the color from the alcohol ink surface and transfer it to the cardstock. Now that may sound complicated, but the basic gist of it is alcohol ink on Yupo paper, and the other piece is just cardstock. Okay, so let's get going with the alcohol lift technique. For this technique, which I did on the backgrounds here, I used a new Gina K Designs stamp set called Just a Little. I thought that artsy flower in the bottom would be perfect for this technique. I like that it has the cool outline and solid images. And then it also has little dots around the flowers, which I thought would be helpful with this card design. I'm using my MISTI stamping tool to make the process easier, but you can use an acrylic block if that's all you have. I'm placing my floral image right where I want it to stamp, and then closing the door on the MISTI. We're going to ink this stamp up with that new alcohol lift ink. Make sure your stamp is clean. Since this is a clear ink with a white felt pad, you don't want to get ink on it, so just make sure your stamp is very clean. So I'm inking this up well, and then I will stamp it firmly onto the alcohol inked background. This is a big stamp, so I put a little muscle into it. If it's a smaller stamp, you don't need to. Okay, so when I take this off, it won't look like much yet. Just set that aside. Now take that white cardstock, the good old-fashioned white cardstock, which happens to be porous, and stamp that image onto it. I like to do it right away if I can. Basically, we lifted the alcohol ink off the first piece and transferred it to the second piece, and it amazes me how much of that ink transfers and how crisp of an image you get. I love 2 cards from one. Next, I'm taking a paper towel, I find that works best, and I'm dabbing off the alcohol lift ink from our first piece. I like to dab until I don't see any shine, any wetness from the ink on the paper. And I rotate the paper towel around so I have a clean spot each time. Once I don't see any shine, I like to dab away or rub away the excess alcohol lift ink. And you'll see your image magically appear. It's such a cool look, like this ghost-like image. So beautiful. This works with pretty much any stamps, but I like the kind of artsy stamps like this that offer really cool design. Okay, so now we have 2 pieces for 2 different cards and 2 very different looks. I did clean my stamp off with Hero Arts Ultra Clean, which is my favorite stamp cleaner, so that it's ready to go again. Next, I have a Birch Press Thanks Sugar Script die cut. And I'm going to use that as a positioning here because I thought I was going to use the thanks greeting, but in the end I changed my mind. I have my Holtz Trimmer out, and I'm holding the 2 stamped backgrounds together so I can cut them both at once. I'm cutting a diagonal line or an angled line on one edge. I just decided I wanted to have some angled lines on this card. So then I want to cut again, but perpendicular to that. Sorry, my engineering ways are coming out here. So I'm lining this piece up, this edge, with the straight line grid on my trimmer, and I will cut again. So I end up with kind of like an X through our background, kind of towards the bottom. And I'll do the same thing with the other piece. I will rearrange these pieces to be together on our card. You could have left them connected if you wanted to, but I thought this would be a fun way to add a little bit of interest. I also left a lot of the image together so that you could really see the pattern that we created with that technique. Okay, so now it's time to arrange all this onto the front of a card. I have a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch white note card, and you can see how I've arranged my pieces, but I separated them a little bit. Here's where I thought I was going to use thanks, but I felt it was too squashed there, so I ended up switching to a different die cut, and I'll save this one for later. I like that this card design could also be used for a horizontal card. Okay, so I decided to add these pieces with some dimension, so I glued craft foam behind the pieces. I used Gina K Connect, which is a nice strong liquid adhesive, glued it to the corner of a piece of white craft foam, and trimmed away the excess. And I'll do this to all 4 pieces, and then glue them to the card with the same glue. Now, if you look up there at the top, you'll see a die that says, "Oh, hello" there. I use that, it's from Simon Says Stamp, to die cut the word hello. And that's what I decided to use on the sentiment for this card instead of the thanks that I had originally planned. Once I have all of my pieces positioned with a little gap between, I want to stamp a sentiment into the gap. I'm using the Altenew Needlework Motif stamp set. This has lots of thin sentiments that are great for tiny areas. I've used it many times in past videos. So to do this, I'm using my MISTI stamping tool, which is very helpful to stamp on a card when there's some dimension on it. Sorry, my head keeps getting in the way there. I place the sentiment into the gap on the front of the card, and then I'll stamp that with a dark teal color. I'm adding the Hello die cut that I got from that Simon Says Stamp Oh Hello There die that I showed you a few minutes ago. I actually die cut 3 of the hellos and glued them on top of each other for a stacked look. People have asked why I stacked them together. It really is just to help the die cut stand out against a busy background. It makes a big difference. So here's a closer look at the first one where we did the alcohol ink and lifted the color away afterwards with the alcohol lift ink. I also stamped the matching envelope. And here's the second card that we used where we stamped that ink that we lifted off onto regular cardstock. And I created a card with the same card design. I like that this technique allows you to get 2 cards with very different looks. Let's do another example of this where I used the pieces, but I interchanged a couple of them for fun. I'm just going to show you this one pretty quickly. I started with a background using alcohol inks in green and blue colors. And this time I'm applying the color using that felt alcohol ink applicator. Now this alcohol ink applicator is the same one that we use for blending, but instead of putting foam on it, we put a little piece of felt that Reinker sells. So you can actually use the same tool and just switch out what's on the tool. Here I'm adding a little bit of blending solution and then using my straw to blow air onto it to move the color around. Once I'm happy with the results, I just set it aside to dry for a little bit. So I did the same stamping as I did before. I stamped the alcohol lift ink with that floral image onto the alcohol inked background, and then I stamped it off onto a piece of white cardstock. So we end up with 2 beautiful images. This time I just trimmed some strips out of it horizontally. So I hold the 2 pieces together, that way they're cut in the same places, and I cut a little bit from the bottom. Then I moved it and cut it a little bit more, not measuring at all, just making sure that I had 3 pieces that showed enough of the image that you could see that continuous floral pattern. So I'm going to glue these onto my card, but mix them up a bit so that each card has a little bit of the white piece and a little bit of the inked piece. I put craft foam behind each of these pieces like I did on the last card and added them to a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note cards. I like that the stamping is continuous across the different pieces. I used that script thanks die cut that I showed you earlier on both of the cards. On this one, the top die cut is cut from some alcohol ink scrap paper. I also added a few sequins here and there. So again, I was able to create 2 cards from one inked background using the alcohol lift ink. I also really like that with this technique, you can make 2 cards pretty quickly. Okay, my next example using the ink shows 2 cards that are made from one alcohol ink background, but with 2 different designs. This time I'm using the Gina K Tropical Tidings stamp set. This has lots of images that would be great for this technique, but I'm using the one on the bottom left. So I placed my alcohol inked piece that was left over from my first card into my MISTI. I'm inking up the stamp with the alcohol lift ink. Again, always be sure that your stamp is clean before using this since you have a white pad with clear ink. So I'll stamp this onto our alcohol inked background, and then I will lift off that ink and stamp it onto a piece of regular cardstock. That's porous cardstock. So I stamp it on there and look at the beautiful soft image I get. If you want it to be darker, you can repeat the process, which I'm going to show you here. I'm putting my alcohol ink piece back into the MISTI. Notice I didn't wipe any of it off yet. I'm going to clean my stamp so I can be sure it's clean before I ink it up again with alcohol lift ink. And I'll stamp it again onto my alcohol inked background. This lifts more color, which I can stamp again onto the cardstock, right on top of the first image. And here you can see the dark, crisp, very good image we get from that. Now back to our alcohol inked piece. I'm first going to dab away some of the ink with a dry paper towel. I'll do this until the shine seems to be gone. always rotating my paper towel so I'm using a clean spot. Once the shine's gone, I can start buffing it to remove all of the ink, and you'll see the image pop out and give you beautiful results. From these two pieces, I made two very simple cards. The first one with the alcohol ink background, I trimmed the background down and matted it on white cardstock before adding it to a pool note card. I then created a stacked thanks die cut that I glued to the card, allowing the background to show. For the other card, I cut a tall strip, and then I added a stacked thanks die cut from pool cardstock, and added a pool cardstock strip down the side of the stamped piece. So there again, we were able to get two cards from one technique. Okay, so for my next two cards, I thought I'd show how you can use the Alcohol Lift Ink Reinker with stencils. So let's start with our alcohol ink background. I have Yupo paper again. I'm squirting lots of different colors of alcohol ink directly onto the paper. Again, I'm putting it on pretty heavy, but you can go lighter if you want to. I decided to kind of do a rainbow of color. So I put a line of each color, but I stop and I use a straw to kind of blow the colors together and move it around so it doesn't look perfect. I also like to put drops of the blending solution on so it moves even more. You can even use a brush to move the color around. Just be sure to clean it when you're done. So keep applying color and blending solution and moving it until you're happy. After I got that first part moving, I decided to go ahead and add some blue and green ink. Again, putting on blending solution and moving the ink as I go, so I get a really fun looking background. Once I was complete, I let it dry for a while, and then I'm taking this new Gina K Lovely Lace stencil and putting it right on top. This is a beautiful stencil that's perfect for this technique. I'll tape it on the back so that the stencil doesn't move when we're doing the technique. Now for this, you need the felt alcohol ink applicator, like I mentioned before. And onto that felt alcohol ink applicator, I'm putting the Tim Holtz Alcohol Lift Ink Reinker. So this is the reinker for the ink pad, but we're actually just using drops from it for this technique. I'll put a few drops of the reinker onto the felt piece, and then I'll pounce this around and move this around over the stencil. Now make sure you don't have too much reinker on your felt, or the excess will creep under the stencil and make a mess. So I like to kind of press it onto my work surface to remove a little of the reinker before bringing it to my stencil. When you tilt it in the light, you'll be able to see the shine where the reinker has landed, so you can be sure you've covered all the areas. Also, you'll find that the applicator that we're using will pick up some of the color, and you'll end up with lighter areas wherever there's an exposed area in the stencil, so you can see it reacting already. Once you've covered the whole area, I like to take a paper towel, a dry one, and lay it on top and just press to try to remove some of the excess alcohol lift ink and the color. I'll rotate my paper towel and do this a few times, and you'll see the open areas get lighter looking because we're lifting the color away from all of the open areas. Once I've removed a lot of the excess by dabbing, I'll take clean paper towel spots and rub away the excess of the ink, so you really soften all those open areas. Once you're done, you can remove the stencil and check out the cool effect. If you need to, you can buff away additional ink, and you really get a nice crisp look that is just beautiful. I trimmed the colorful panel down and die cut a heart window with a heart die, and I can save the die cut heart for another card. I added that with some foam adhesive onto a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch note card. I stacked 3 friend die cuts together and then added a black die cut on top, and I glued that into the heart opening. I then stamped a Miss You Always sentiment underneath from that same Needlework Motif Altenew stamp set that I showed you earlier in the video. I decided to keep this card very simple so the focus would be on the unique background. This stencil technique is very fun, and one of the other great benefits of it is that if you create an alcohol ink background that you don't really love, but you were just experimenting and learning, you can use this alcohol lift ink technique with the stencil and give it a completely new look. Okay, I have one more stenciled card technique. This time I started with an alcohol ink background on Yupo paper again, where I used the felt applicator to swipe the ink back and forth diagonally across the panel. So that's how I get that stripe look. That's really beautiful. So I have another Gina K stencil. This is another new one. And I'll tape this on to that alcohol inked background. And again, I'll use my felt alcohol ink applicator to apply some drops of the Alcohol Lift Reinker. I made sure I didn't have too much of the Reinker, just a couple drops. And this time I'm really moving it around, swirling it around, and I found that worked great too. You'll see right away that the background starts to soften, so we know we're lifting that ink away. Once you've covered the whole area, you can use a dry paper towel to dab away the excess before removing the stencil. Once I see less shine on it, I can remove the stencil, dab away the rest of the ink, and then rub it away to buff it to get a nice smooth result. Now I turn this into a card just like I did on the last example, adding the Simple Friend die cut and lots of love stamped below. Simple designs like this are great for showcasing any kind of alcohol ink background technique that you may do. So there you have an introduction to the Alcohol Lift ink and the fun things you can use it for, along with your alcohol ink backgrounds. So I list all the supplies I use below in my YouTube description. In the middle, I link to one of my early alcohol ink background videos, and I also link to a video that Tim Holtz did where he introduced these products. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon. Have a great day.